This is a men's club breakfast this morning, and we have this morning a guest speaker, Yehudit Shier Weisberg, who's talking about the creation of Israel and Palestine in the modern era. Is that about right?
So, kind of.
Kind of, it's close, but that's why I'm here to find out exactly what she has to say. So, without any further ado.
Okay, thank you. The reason that I'm doing this is because I thought in the past that I was pretty well educated about Israel. I went to Jewish day school, I studied, I went to university in Israel, and I thought that I basically knew the most important things. And thus I was very, very surprised a number of years ago when I heard Jacques Gauthier, some of you may have heard him, the non-Jewish international lawyer, speak about what Chaim Weizmann described as the most momentous event in our history, perhaps since the exile. And I thought, wait a minute, I never studied that. I went to day school, nobody ever mentioned it. And so I started to do research, and as they say, mihon lahon, I have this presentation. So before I start, I'd just like you to look at the words on the screen. The use of certain words can influence the way we think. And just to get a show of hands of who agrees with this statement. Yeah, okay. So that the use of certain words is very, very important. So as an example, if I'm reading, and I like to use South America as an example because I must admit I'm quite ignorant of the politics there. So if I were to read a newspaper article and this following quote was written in the article, "We will consider your proposals." But if the reporter added an adjective that it was said by a moderate leader of X, I would, in my mind, hear it as, "We'll consider your proposals." But if the journalist would write that it was said by a hardline leader of X, just using a different adjective would probably make me hear the quote in my mind as, "We will consider your proposals." So just that one word would influence the way I read the quote. As another example, knowing nothing about A or B, if I read that A liberated territory from B, to whom would I think the territory belonged? Without knowing anything. Just that language, A liberated the territory from B. Liberated from B, yes, I would think that it belongs to A. If I read A and B have disputed territories, to whom would I think the territory belonged? I wouldn't know. And if I read that A occupies B's territory, to whom would I think that the territory belonged? B. And then what would I think of A if I read that A is building illegal settlements on B's territory? Again, without knowing anything about A or B, I'd have a very negative attitude towards A. Another example of language. What would I think if I read about Argentinians in the context of Argentina? I would think the Argentinians are the people who are the native people of Argentina. Bolivians, Bolivia, Irish, Ireland, English, England. What about Palestinians when there's never, ever been a country by that name? So again, just as a preface, it's always important to keep the size of Israel in perspective. And this is Israel superimposed on Canada. There are a few Montrealers here. And if you put Israel on its side, it doesn't even go all the way to Montreal. But a very important map, and we're going to come back to this, is Israel in the Middle East. And all the countries in green are Arab countries. This does not include non-Arab Muslim countries. And as I say, we're going to come back to this map. So part one of this presentation, the origin of the name Palestine. Where did it come from? Oops. So just a quick reminder of our history. Here's a map of how the 12 tribes settled when we came back to Israel under Joshua. And pay attention that we settled on both sides of the Jordan River. This is a map of Israel under the kingdom of King David and Solomon. Again, much more larger than we have today. And again, way over the other side of the Jordan River. But as we know, Israel lies at the crossroads between Africa and Asia, and any country who wanted to gain dominion of the area ended up by occupying Israel. So we have the northern kingdom destroyed in the year 722 before the Common Era by the Assyrians. We have the first temple destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. The Jews return under Cyrus, rebuild the second temple. And after the Maccabees ruled for 100 years, the Romans occupied the land. Romans destroy the second temple in 70. We have the story of Masada, but where, for the purpose of our talk today, it's crucial to understand what happened after the Bar Kokhba rebellion was brutally put down by Emperor Hadrian. So after crushing the rebellion in the year 136, the Roman Emperor Hadrian decided not only to defeat the Jews, but to try and erase all connection between Jews, and that's the name that we have from the tribe Judah and Judea, and the land of Israel. So what did he do? In the olden days, leaders knew history. And Hadrian knew that long before, we had a very, very cruel enemy by the name of the Plishtim. They think the name Plishtim comes from the Hebrew word polesh, meaning invader. We have many stories about the Plishtim. We, of course, have David and Goliath and Shimshon. So what he did to try and erase all Jewish connection to the land of Israel is he attached the province of Judea, again, where we get our name Jew, to Syria, and he renamed the land. He renamed it after our enemy, who no longer existed, Plishtim, and the Latin corruption became Palestina. And thus we get the name Palestine for the first time. So Hadrian's joining the territory of Judea to Syria and renaming it Syria Palestina was for the sole purpose of attempting to erase the connection between the Jewish people and her land. There's something. So there were many other conquerors of the land of Israel. We have the Byzantines, tribes from Arabia called Arabs, Crusades, non-Arab Muslims from Egypt called Mamluks, and the Ottoman Turks. Throughout these conquests, many Jews were massacred and exiled from the land of Israel. Still to this day, we finish the Pesach Seder and Yom Kippur with the words, next year in Jerusalem. But what I never was taught when I went to Hebrew school was there were always Jews in the land of Israel. It was always presented to me, and I don't know about to you, that we were exiled from our land for 2,000 years and then we came back. But we must remember that there were always Jews living in the land of Israel. Here's a slide of a mosaic that was found a year ago this past summer in an excavation partly involving Canadians at Tel Hukok. And this shul, this synagogue, is from the 5th century. Throughout the land of Israel, you can go and see shuls, synagogues, from the Byzantine period, the 4th to the 7th centuries. This is a picture in the same area of the mosaic that was found this past summer. And it actually has a picture of Shimshon, Samson, holding the gates of Gaza. This golden 7-branched menorah from the 7th century CE was discovered in this past summer. Again, you have the menorah, the shofar. This is a map of Jewish communities in Israel between the 7th to 11th centuries. Towards the end of the rule of the Mamluks at the close of the 15th century, Christian and Jewish visitors and pilgrims noted the presence of substantial Jewish communities. Records report nearly 30 Jewish urban and rural communities at the opening of the 16th century. But the conquerors made it very tough for Jews living in Israel. Not one of the conquerors made it an independent country. Only the Jews made Israel an independent state, and only the Jews made Jerusalem their capital city. And not one of the conquerors took care of the land of Israel. They destroyed trees and plants. The soil was carried away by wind and rain. The water backed up and formed swamps. And that's why we ended up with malaria and swamps in the north of Israel and a desert in the south. Although Jews always lived in the land of Israel, due to the high taxes imposed on them, mainly by the Muslim occupiers, they congregated mainly in the small urban areas. Then, beginning in the 1830s, young Jews from Poland, Yemen, and Russia began immigrating to the land of Israel and cultivating the neglected land. Now, throughout all these centuries, in the Christian world, the area, including the land of Israel, continued to be called Palestine since the time of the Emperor Hadrian, who tried to erase the connection between the Jewish people and her land. It's important to remember that there was never a country called Palestine. It was a geographical area. Jumping ahead to the Dreyfus affair, where a French Jewish captain was falsely accused of being a spy, and who's in Paris at the time and recording the events for a Vienna newspaper is none other than Theodor Herzl. And he was shocked by seeing the mobs of Parisians running through the streets calling death to the Jews. And he became the father of what is called political Zionism, that the Jews needed their own political independence. Many Jews, as I mentioned, were already living in the land of Israel, had already moved to the land of Israel to cultivate, but he said, we have to have our own independent country. Just 2 years later, he convened the First Zionist Congress, August 29, 1897. Here's some pictures. Because for the Christian world, the general geographical name of the area that included the land of Israel remained Palestine, delegates at the First Zionist Congress at Basel used the name Palestine as the location for the home of the Jewish people. This was the name used in the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917. His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. But the area that included the land of Israel was now part of the Ottoman Empire. So, summary of this part of the presentation: the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the land of Israel in order to erase the connection of the Jewish people to her land. He renamed it Palestine, the Latin corruption of Plishtim, the former enemy of the Jewish people. Because the Roman Empire became Christian, the name Palestine stuck, and this name became the known geographical name for this area of the world. There was never a country by that name, and although many Jews were massacred and exiled, there were always Jewish communities in the land of Israel. Part 2, the mandate for Palestine and international law. The Ottoman Empire falls. In Europe, the Paris Peace Conference was convened to deal with the terms and future boundaries of the countries in Europe. And after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, the San Remo Peace Conference was convened on April 24th, 25th, 1920, to make decisions about the ex-Turkish territories in Asia. And this was the event that, in the words of Chaim Weizmann, this is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement, meaning Zionism, and it is perhaps no exaggeration to say in the whole history of our people since the exile. I was never taught about the San Remo Conference. Just curious if anyone else was taught about this. Okay, it's just been disappeared from our history. So why is it so significant? At this conference, Arab national aspirations were recognized. The Arabs were given the territories of Mesopotamia, which became Iraq in 1932 under a British mandate. And I should just say that there was a feeling that the people of this part of the world, they were going to become independent and they were going to have their own sovereign nations, but they needed to be guided in the meantime under a mandate system. So the Arabs were given, as I mentioned, Mesopotamia, which became Iraq in 1932. And pay attention to the years. I always thought that Israel was the only newcomer in the bloc. Syria, which became independent in 1946, and Lebanon 1943 under a French mandate, in addition to the already existing state of Hijaz, which along with Najd became Saudi Arabia in 1932. And it was at the San Remo Conference where Palestine was created to be the national home of the Jewish people, just as the borders of Syria, Lebanon, and Mesopotamia, Iraq, were created for the Arabs. That was its only purpose. They delineated a territory to be called Palestine for the Jewish people. In recognition of the persecutions of the Jewish people under many foreign occupiers of the land of Israel and the countless forced exiles, including under the Turks during World War I don't know how many of you know that Tel Aviv was, the Jews from Tel Aviv were expelled during World War I, and 1 out of 5 died during World War I. So because of all these countless massacres and exiles and deaths, the area called Palestine was reserved for the Jewish people as a whole, and not only for the Jews living there at the time. 51 member countries, the entire League of Nations, unanimously declared on July 24, 1922, whereas recognition has been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. And that's from the preamble to the mandate for Palestine. In Hebrew, the name Palestina was always followed by the letters Aleph Yud in brackets. You can see especially on the green stamp, you see Aleph Yud standing for Eretz Yisrael. And it was called Palestina I for Eretz Yisrael. In the early drafts of the mandate, the words Eretz Yisrael appeared in full in brackets next to the name Palestine in the preamble of the document. However, these two words were deleted in a unilateral British revision of the draft mandate of March 15, 1920, and I guess our leadership was so anxious to get the mandate passed that they didn't make a big deal about this deletion. What were Britain's obligations as mandatory? I'm just going to look at 2 articles. Article 6, the administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sectors of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration and shall encourage close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. And Article 5, the mandatory shall be responsible for seeing that no Palestine territory shall be ceded or leased to or in any way placed under the control of the government of any foreign power. So again, the British were supposed to help Jews come to Israel and not give away any of the land to anyone else. This was to be the Jewish homeland. What do you notice about it? Includes what became Jordan. So what happened? The British mandatory was not a sovereign. All its rights and obligations relating to Palestine emanated from the mandate for Palestine. The mandatory was a trustee for the League of Nations. It was not given the power to take any steps which violated the terms of the mandate. However, the British, actually their steamships, their ships moved to oil. And at the time, it was the Arabs who had the oil. In addition, they made promises to the Arabs, trying to get them to revolt against the Turks. The Hashemite family was kicked out of what became Saudi Arabia. They were kicked out by the Sauds, and that's why it became called Saudi Arabia. They installed Faisal in Syria. He was kicked out, and he was installed in Iraq. But what about his brother Abdallah? Had to give him something. So the British, right before the mandate was passed, inserted a paragraph that it could divide the mandate. And that's exactly what they did. In 1922, right before the mandate was passed unanimously, the mandate for Palestine was divided into Cisjordan, meaning west of the Jordan, and Transjordan, meaning east of the Jordan. The minute they made that division, all Jewish immigration and settlement in Transjordan was now forbidden. Jewish settlement in these areas was forbidden. And then in 1923, after the mandate was passed, the British illegally gave further land, the Golan Heights, to the French, which became part of Syria. The creation of yet another Arab state in eastern Palestine, today Jordan, on 77% of the landmass of the original mandate intended for a Jewish national home, in no way changed the status of Jews west of the Jordan River, nor did it inhibit their right to settle anywhere in western Palestine, the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The mandate for Palestine, as I mentioned, was unanimously approved by the Council of the League of Nations in 1922, which was comprised at that time of 51 countries. The 1924 Anglo-American Convention on Palestine included the whole text of the Palestine Mandate, and it was also incorporated into U.S. law on June 30th, 1922. But what happened in reality? The British did not keep any of their obligations under the mandate. Under Article 6 of the mandate that we saw, Britain was obligated to help and encourage Jewish immigration into the land. If the British had kept this obligation, Jews trying to escape from Hitler would have had a place to go. Instead, the British had gunboats out and would not let the Jews in. And then, because some of the Jews started fighting the British in the land of Israel, the British had enough, gave back the whole mandate to the United Nations, which in 1946 took over the mission of the League of Nations, which had dissolved itself and transferred its mission to the United Nations. The present United Nations Charter recognizes its obligation to uphold the commitments of the League of Nations. Article 80 of the UN Charter states that rights gained through a mandate will not expire as a result of the expiration of the mandate. And this principle of law, that rights once granted or recognized under a treaty or other legal instrument do not expire with the expiration of that treaty or instrument, is now codified in Article 71B of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and also the Southwest Africa Decision on Mandates, confirmed that all rights derived from mandates are still in full force and effect and do not expire. So according to international law, valid to this day, Jews are allowed to settle anywhere west of the Jordan River. Thus, it becomes clear that the UN's General Assembly, November 29, 1947, partition plan, which was to further give away much of the remaining land for Jewish settlement and partition it further between Jews and Arabs, the partition plan that people wrongly think is the legal basis for Israel, not only has no legal standing, as the General Assembly can only make recommendations, it was actually illegal, for the United Nations had no authority to change the status of the rights given already to the Jewish people. So a quick summary of this part. In recognition of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, Palestine was created to be the national home of the Jewish people, just as Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon were created for the Arabs, all under the mandate system. The rights given to the Jewish people under the mandate for Palestine are still in effect. Jews, according to international law, are allowed to settle anywhere west of the Jordan River, in spite of what Obama and others say. Part 3, the evolution of the name Palestine and the creation of the Palestinian people. So how did the Arabs view the further partition of the land intended for the Jews? The Arabs, having already received over 77% of the original area designated Palestine, rejected the idea of partitioning what remained of Palestine and also rejected the very name Palestine. So, for example, a local Arab leader, Abd al-Mahdi, testified before the Peel Commission in 1937 as follows, quote, "There is no such land. Palestine is a term invented by the Zionists. There's no Palestine in the Bible. Our land was for hundreds of years a part of Syria." In 1956, Ahmed Shukri proclaimed from the podium of the UN as the Arab League's ambassador there, quote, "Such a creature as Palestine does not exist at all. This land is nothing but the southern portion of Greater Syria." So what about the name Palestinian? After the creation of the mandate, the Jews enthusiastically took on the name Palestinians. So until 1948, when the State of Israel was established, the term Palestinian meant Jews living in Palestine. The Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post until 1948. Bank Leumi L'Israel that was incorporated in 1902 was called the Anglo-Palestine Company. Here's a picture from tickets for what became the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra was called the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra, and if you can read the Hebrew, Hatizmoret HaPhilharmonit HaEretz Yisrael. So how is it that Arabs now claim that there is a so-called Palestinian people who are the inhabitants of their country, Palestine? When did this happen? So if we go back to the map that we saw at near the beginning of the presentation, you just look at the map, who's David and who is Goliath? So in the 1960s and 1970s, people in the West like the underdog. And so all these leftists from Europe went to Israel to volunteer to work on the kibbutz. But the KGB, that was making all these so-called liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, advised Arab propaganda to change the perception of Israel as David and the Arabs as Goliath. So what do? You can't change the map, but what you can do is you can create a smaller people. Even though they had rejected the name Palestine in the past, Arab propaganda realized that it could be very beneficial for their cause. They created a Palestinian people. But no one seems to ask the question, why would the Arabs take on a non-Arabic name that they cannot even pronounce? There is no sound P in the Arabic language, and yet all of a sudden they have become Palestinians. Arab propaganda relies on the fact that most people are ignorant of the origin of the name Palestine and its history. By taking on the name Palestinians, Arabs could now portray themselves as the original inhabitants of the land, Palestine. So what did the land look like when they claimed that there were all these Arab Palestinians living there. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen pictures of the early Chalutzim working the land. Tel Aviv, this is a famous picture of the raffle. Where Tel Aviv is, 1909, was just sand dunes. Leo Kahn, a photographer, traveled in Israel in 1912. And here are just a few of his pictures, just to get a sense of what the land looked like. Mark Twain wrote in The Innocents Abroad, 1867, "There is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent." He was talking about Emek Yisrael. "Not for 30 miles in either direction. One may ride 10 miles hereabouts and not see 10 human beings." Again, different pictures. The Jews are starting to build the land. Looks a little bit different. Bay of Haifa, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, the road from Jerusalem to Shechem. Here's another example. As you know, that Shechem is called Nablus. Where did it get that name? So the Romans had built a new city next to Shechem called Neapolis. But the Arabs cannot pronounce P, so Neapolis became Nablus. It's another example. Kibbutz Bet Alpha. Report of the British Royal Commission in 1913. The area was underpopulated and remained economically stagnant until the arrival of the first Zionist pioneers in the 1880s who came to rebuild the Jewish land. Jewish development of the country also attracted large numbers of other immigrants, both Jewish and Arab. Walid Shoaban, a former PLO terrorist, stated, "As I lived in Palestine, everyone I knew could trace their heritage back to the original country their great-grandparents came from. The fact is that today's Palestinians are immigrants from the surrounding nations. I grew up well knowing the history and origins of today's Palestinians as being from Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Christians from Greece, Muslim Shurkas from Russia, Muslims from Bosnia, and the Jordanians next door. My grandfather, who was a dignitary in Bethlehem, almost lost his life by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini after being accused of selling land to Jews. He used to tell us that his village, Bet Sahur, in Bethlehem County, was empty before his father settled in the area with 6 other families. The town has now grown to 30,000 inhabitants." As an example of the mass Arab immigration into the land of Israel, once the Jews started creating work opportunities, Telek Bey el-Horani, the governor of the Haran, southwestern Syria, stated in an interview with Lasiri published on August 12, 1934, that in the last few months, from 30,000 to 36,000 Haranese had entered Palestine and settled there. Very interesting. In March 2012, the Hamas Minister of the Interior and of National Security, Fatih Hamad, said on Egyptian TV the following. He was trying to appeal to the Egyptians to help them in Gaza, and he said, quote, "Every Palestinian in Gaza and throughout Palestine can prove his Arab roots, whether from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, or anywhere. We have blood ties. So where's your affection and mercy? Personally, half my family is Egyptian. We are all like that, brothers. Half of the Palestinians are Egyptians, and the other half are Saudis. Who are the Palestinians? We have many families called Al-Masri, similar to the Hebrew Mitzri, and on. We're Egyptians, we're Arabs, we're Muslims." So many Arabs whose origins are from other countries now call themselves Palestinians. But what do they mean by Palestine? Do Arabs call all this land Palestine, or just land that remains in the heart and the hands of Jews? So the State of Israel is created 5th of Iyar, May 14th, 1948, and immediately the Arabs attack. 5 Arab armies attack in a genocidal war against the State of Israel, and they didn't hide their intentions. Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League, declared, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre." Israel survived the war. Armistice agreements were signed in 1949 between Israel and neighboring Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. The agreements ended the official hostilities of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The armistice demarcation line is also referred to as the Green Line. Why? Because green ink was used to mark the map. That's the origin of the Green Line. The 1949 armistice agreements, the Green Line, were never recognized as borders. So, for example, from the agreement with Israel-Egypt, the armistice demarcation line is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary, and we have a similar quote from the Israel-Jordanian armistice agreement. So there is absolutely no basis at all for calling the 1949 armistice lines the 1967 borders. There is no such thing as the 1967 borders. They are only the 1949 armistice agreements with no political implications at all. During the war, Jews who had lived in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza for thousands of years were slaughtered. The Jews in Hebron had already been slaughtered in 1929, and any surviving Jews were expelled, or in modern parlance, ethnically cleansed from these areas. And then, very interesting, the Jordanians learned from Emperor Hadrian. So they were called, the area east of the Jordan River was called the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan. Trans meaning east of the Jordan River. But now they've occupied Judea and Samaria, which is west of the Jordan River. They needed to rename the land Judea and Samaria. Why? What's wrong with those names? Those names were recognized in Turkish documents, in British documents, for hundreds and hundreds of years. That area was referred to as Judea and Samaria. Why did the Arabs need to rename the land? What's wrong with the name Judea and Samaria?
Jewish.
Sounds Jewish. So what did they do? They dropped the name Trans East from their title. They now became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, no longer Transjordan, east of the Jordan. Now they're on the west side of the Jordan River. They rename the area, Judea and Samaria, to try and make people forget that it's Jewish land. They rename it the West Bank. That's the origin of the name, the West Bank. It doesn't really look like a bank of a river to me, but that is the name that they chose. Again, like Emperor Hadrian, renaming land to erase Jewish connection to the land. And again, they dropped the name Trans from their title, and they become the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. We should remember and remind ourselves that Judea and Samaria is the birthplace of the Jewish people. We have the Cave of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs in Hebron. That's where King David ruled before he established Jerusalem as the capital city in 1000 before the Common Era. The burial site of Joseph is in Shechem. But even though the land was renamed the West Bank, almost all Arab localities in Judea and Samaria have retained biblical Jewish names, thus reaffirming their Jewish roots. Here's a slide of many of these names, but for example, Beitin is Beitel, Jabba was Geva, Jenin was En-Ganin, on and on and on. You see always Jewish roots in most of the Arab names of the localities in Judea and Samaria. It's interesting to note that when the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in 1964, there were no so-called Jewish settlements in these so-called occupied territories. Judea and Samaria, renamed the West Bank, was annexed to Jordan, and Gaza was ruled by Egypt. Was this land called Palestine by the Arabs? Was this land part of the land demanded by the PLO? So if you look at their original charter of 1964, Article 24, this organization does not exercise any regional sovereignty over the West Bank and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, on the Gaza Strip, or the Chima area, the Golan Heights. So as long as this area was ruled by Arabs, the PLO made no claim for this land. Even without the so-called West Bank and Gaza, the Arabs try yet again to destroy Israel in 1967. By the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had liberated Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, the lands where for thousands of years Jews had lived. Only for 19 years, from 48 to 67, as a result of the Arab slaughter and expulsion, no Jews were allowed to live there. During these 19 years, there was no demand to turn these areas into a so-called Palestinian state. And the Arabs living there were not called Palestinians. But now that these areas were once again in Jewish hands, they suddenly became Palestinian lands. Again, Walid Shoabat, a former PLO terrorist, acknowledged, quote, "Why is it that on June 4th, 1967, I was a Jordanian, and overnight I became a Palestinian? We did not particularly mind Jordanian rule. The teaching of the destruction of Israel was a definite part of the curriculum, but we considered ourselves Jordanians until the Jews returned to Jerusalem. Then all of a sudden, we were Palestinians. They removed the star from the Jordanian flag, and all at once we had a Palestinian flag." And again, another Arab American journalist, Joseph Farah, wrote, "Isn't it interesting that prior to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, there was no serious movement for a Palestinian homeland? And I can't help but wonder why all these Palestinians suddenly discovered their national identity after Israel won the war." But it's very interesting to actually get a quote from a PLO guy who was still a PLO guy at the time of the quote. Zahir Hussein, executive member of the PLO, in an interview with the Dutch newspaper True, March 1977, said, quote, "The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for our Arab unity. In reality today, there's no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism." So summary of this part: although the Arabs rejected the name Palestine, they, under the guidance of the KGB, came to the realization that they could very easily change the perception that Israel was David and the Arabs were Goliath by creating a smaller people. By naming Arabs, most of whom came to the land of Israel after Jews had created work opportunities starting in the late 19th century, by naming them Palestinians, even though it is a non-Arabic name that they cannot even pronounce, they have successfully turned history on its head. The indigenous people, the Jews, are now viewed as newcomers who have stolen so-called Palestinian land. We also saw that what Arabs define as Palestinian land changes according to what land is in the hands of the Jews. Thus, from 48 to 67, there was no demand to turn the so-called West Bank or Gaza into a Palestinian state. Part 4. A two-state solution west of the Jordan River. So what would happen if Israel caved into international pressure and allowed a so-called Palestinian state to be created in Judea and Samaria? Whatever the final contours of a Palestinian state, it would entail a frontier of at least 300 kilometers, approximately 6 times longer than the Gaza front. And we know what happened when Israel pulled out of Gaza. Here's a picture of a greenhouse, and below it, the same greenhouse turned into smuggling tunnels. As you know, in 2012, 1 million Israelis in Beersheba, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Kiryat Gat, and scores of kibbutzim and villages were held hostage by Gaza-based Arab terrorism as a result of the 2005 expulsion. These attacks have continued as recently as this past Friday, January 3rd, 2014, where rockets were again sent from Gaza. More than 3 million Israelis live within range of the rocket and mortar attacks, and these numbers will grow, for on December 31st, just a few days ago, 2013, Hamas test-fired a medium-range M75 missile, which carried a slightly larger warhead and longer range than similar rockets that can reach 50 miles, a distance that includes Tel Aviv. Here's the building hit in Rishon LeZion, November 2012. Unlike the Gaza front, much of a so-called Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria would be adjacent to Israel's most populous urban centers, from the environs of Haifa to Beersheba and beyond in the south. However, unlike in Gaza, a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria would reduce Israel's width in its most populous areas to a minuscule 11 to 25 kilometers. But even more important than geographical expanse or lack thereof is topographical structure. Unlike the flat Gaza Strip, the limestone hills that comprise Judea and Samaria dominate the urbanized coastal plain, together with much of Israel's vital infrastructure, its only international airport, vital centers of civilian government and military command, and 80% of its population and commercial activity. But the question is this relevant if giving the so-called Palestinians their own state in the so-called West Bank and Gaza were to bring peace? So there is a prevalent myth that once the Palestinians get their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, the conflict with Israel will come to an end. And therefore it's very important to know what they are saying in Arabic and not only in English. So the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas has made it clear that having a state in the West Bank and Gaza would not be sufficient and would not mean the end of the conflict. So, for example, still today, in every school book, every map that's published in Judea and Samaria under the PA, the map, what they call Palestine, includes all of Israel. Palestinian Authority TV, which is totally under the control of the PA, keeps reinforcing the message that all of Israel is Palestinian land. And so here's a song that was published, sung repeatedly on PA up until December 2013, and I'm sure it will be rebroadcast. My beautiful country Palestine includes cities and regions in Israel: Jaffa, Tiberias, Akko, Haifa, Bet Shan, Tzfat, Ramla, the Galilee, Negev, Natzeret, on and on and on. These are what are taught to their children as being Palestinian cities. On Friday, July 19th, 2013, on the eve of the renewed peace talks with Israel, PA Minister of Religious Affairs Mahmoud al-Habash, in the presence of PA Chairman Mahmoud Abbas, said in his Friday sermon that when PA leaders signed agreements with Israel, they knew how to walk the right path, which leads to achievement exactly like the Prophet did in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And as a reminder, Muhammad signed a 10-year truce at Hudaybiyah with the tribes of Mecca, but 2 years later he attacked and conquered them. So every time you hear it's like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you know exactly what they mean. Again, August 2013, right before and after the opening of the latest round of peace talks, greetings to all our listeners and happy holiday to you, our people in occupied Palestine, 1948 Palestine, the 1948 territories. Greetings to our people in Akko, Natzeret, Tiberia, Haifa, and Jaffa. May your Palestinian identity be rooted in your hearts and minds. Allah willing, one day Palestine will be Palestine again. during an episode of the program Sights of Jerusalem, broadcast in October of 2013. And again, while the peace talks are going on, official Palestinian Authority TV dehumanized Israelis and Jews as crows and rats. In addition, the program denied Jewish history and the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, calling Israelis foreigners. On the same day that Abbas talked peace at the UN, he described Ahmad Jabara, Abu Sukar, a terrorist who killed 15 Jews, as worthy of being named the most noble among the noble, worthy of receiving the utmost honor and appreciation from us. And again, we know what happened just last week when the latest batch of murderers were released. Again, quotes on and on, referring to territories occupied in 48. In an interview on September 14th, 2011, the PA's ambassador to Lebanon, Abdullah, stated, "When we have a state accepted as a member of the United Nations, this is not the end of the conflict. This is not a solution to the conflict. This is only a new framework that will change the rules of the game." He further stated that any refugees in the new so-called Palestinian state will not be considered citizens. They would need to go back to Israel proper. So in other words, they want a state with no Jews, but what they define as refugees would have to go into Israel. So they're asking for another state in addition. In an interview aired on Al Jazeera, September 23, 2011, member of the Fatah Central Committee, Abbas Zaki, stated, "The settlement should be based upon the borders of June 4th, 1967. When we say that the settlement should be based upon these borders, President Abbas understands, we understand, and everybody knows that the greater goal cannot be accomplished in one go. If Israel withdraws from Jerusalem, evacuates the 650,000 settlers, and dismantles the wall, what will become of Israel? It will come to an end." And here is the new logo of Fatah, again showing all of Israel as Palestine. In addition, would any country give up territory needed for its existential existence and rely upon another government, which, as we have seen recently, can be overthrown? We have forgotten about the time when the holding on to Judea, Samaria, and Gaza was not viewed as a right-wing versus a left-wing position. We should remind ourselves of Yitzhak Rabin's last speech that he gave to the Knesset before he was murdered. And in this speech, and you can find it on the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he says, "We view the permanent solution in the framework of the State of Israel, which will include most of the area of the land of Israel as it was under the rule of the British Mandate, and alongside it a Palestinian entity. We would like this to be an entity which is less than a state, and which will independently run the lives of the Palestinians under its authority. The borders of the State of Israel during the permanent solution will be beyond the lines which existed before the Six-Day War. We will not return to the 4th of June 1967 lines." And he goes on to talk about the security border of the State of Israel will be located in the Jordan Valley, in the broadest meaning of that term, which is very relevant to the discussions going on now. He talks about the first point, United Jerusalem, which will include both Ma'ale Adumim and Givat Ze'ev, meaning including E1. He talks about the addition of Gush Etzion, Efrat, Beitar, other communities, and he talks about the establishment of blocks of settlements in Judea and Samaria, like the one in Gush Katif in Gaza. He had no idea that Israel would be evacuating Gaza. It is worth reminding ourselves of this map. The international community has never questioned the borders assigned to the Arabs at the San Remo Conference, which gave them Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria under French and British mandates. Why are the borders of the Jewish state questioned? Jordan's rulers once acknowledged that Palestine and Transjordan are one. That's from King Abdallah first, told the Arab League in Cairo in 48. And the truth is that Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan, King Hussein said in 1981. Many advocate for a two-state solution to the struggle between the so-called Palestinians and the Jews. Why has the world forgotten that Palestine was already divided and the Arabs received 77% of the land? Transjordan was part of the Palestine that was created. So there is already a two-state solution. There's already a Palestinian state. But the actual definition of Palestine seems to be lands controlled by the Jews. Thus, until 1967, the so-called West Bank and Gaza were not considered to be Palestinian land and only became so after the Jews returned to this land. Why has the 1949 armistice line, the Green Line, become sacrosanct to the extent that people claim that Jews have no right to settle in their land, land belonging to the Jewish people by virtue of history, by their rebuilding the land, and according to international law? Why did this armistice line become the so-called 1967 border? Why are the legitimate legal rights of the Jewish people to the area west of the Jordan River, never mind east of the Jordan River, denied? Jews lived in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria for thousands of years. Only for 19 years, 48 to 67, were there no Jews living there as a result of Arab massacres and the expulsion of every last survivor, ethnic cleansing. Do these 19 years turn this land into Arab land? I am puzzled why some people who call themselves liberal and progressive, and I assume are generally against ethnic cleansing, nevertheless call for the forcible expulsion of Jews from part of their homeland, the very birthplace of the Jewish people. So I would like to end this presentation with a review of the following maps. What Israel was once under King David and Solomon. The Jews always lived in the land of Israel. Here's the map of Jews, 7th to 11th century. That there already is a two-state solution, that Judea and Samaria is the birthplace of the Jewish people, the topographical structure of Judea and Samaria, how tiny Israel is in comparison to Canada, and how tiny Israel is in comparison to the Middle East. So I want to thank you, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Yes.